Not So Late Night, a celebration of short stories, conversation, and music, takes place at Mad Art Gallery in St. Louis. The evening offers 3 groundbreaking authors reading from their works and sharing their ideas behind them, as well as music by Katera to set the mood and complement these short stories. Our host for the evening is local author Ron Austin, who sees these kind of events as vital.
There's really nothing like, especially if you're hosting an event and you see someone on the stage and they're really reading something and they're really engaged with it, and you can see that they're having fun, and you can look into the audience and you can see people's faces and their reactions, and you can see that connection in real time. That's beautiful.
First to the stage, Ron shares a reading from his story recently featured in the literary magazine Pleiades, Phaedra Banks, Swerves, Jukes, and Dunks on Death.
Thanks to a brand new Catacombs Incorporated campaign, North St. Louisans could bring loved ones back from the dead. An iteration of death itself had been contracted to manage the necropolis, collect flesh for enchanted textile manufacture, and facilitate resurrections. To make the campaign fair and sustainable, consumers needed to challenge and beat their region-specific version of death in a mortal duel. Clairvoyants on the company's marketing team had proposed a resurrection campaign, basing their strategic planning on consumer surveys that describe feelings of loss and suffocating futility. Furthermore, the clairvoyants figured that campaign would distract detractors of the company's metaphysical gentrification program. Now those gifted folks could compile celestial atlases out of common palms, decode arcane scriptures, and foresee tragedy in scattered chicken bones. But not a single one of them predicted the campaign would turn out to be a massive success, or that grieving mothers would prove to be death's fiercest competitors. The mothers wanted to snatch death out his Adidas sneakers, fashion axes and shovels from his femurs, dig up and split caskets, yank sons and daughters up from cool dirt, young bodies unharmed, robust and whole, chunky as sweet potatoes. Surviving kin begged the mothers to quit all that scheming nonsense and suggested they stick to knitting, gardening, gossiping, spoiling nephews and nieces, stirring soup, twisting braids, haggling at yard sales, managing sideline hustles, and musing in late afternoon sunlight. No need to be heroines. No need to risk defeat and transmogrification. Death could have been decent and just taken the souls of his new rivals, but he got off on turning germaphobes into dirty boots, conceited folks into stringy, wet clumps of magenta weave. A chorus of unheeded brothers, uncles, sisters, and cousins called the mothers pig-headed and told them, "Y'all need to quit chasing that pain before it turns around and bites you back. Ain't no use suffering over what can't be undone." But no, nobody knew how unnatural it felt to outlive a child. Nobody knew how elemental shame could pollute the bloodstream with their veins, disintegrate hair into dust. Nobody knew how guilt reframed every embarrassing gurgle and burp out of their bodies as betrayal. The mothers couldn't give up that chance to kick death's tailbone, spit venom in his goddamn eye. Determined to win, the mothers recruited would-be champions from kitchens, beauty shops, supermarkets, church basements, and back porches. They revived hidden talents, met death at Fairground Park, fought for their children, and every so often, neighborhood gossip spread rumors of women who challenged and beat death so their sons and daughters could live to become astronauts, surgeons, soldiers, accountants, and deacons. So it wasn't out of the question for Phaedra Banks to whoop death in a game of one-on-one and resurrect her son Jackson. Before retiring from the league, Phaedra's prowess as a collegiate basketball veteran had become mythical. Superstitious coaches claimed a shot of her sweat could transform bench warmers into starters. Chewing a strand of her hair could increase vertical leaps by 2 feet. And being 53 hardly diminished her fitness and talents. All those years of suicide sprints and squats had consolidated into massive inner resources. Once the bad news broke about Jackson, Neighborhood folks expected Phaedra to hop into a clean pair of Air Max sneakers, snap on her goggles, and crush Death's 21 to zilch, but nah. Other women might have believed their sons and daughters shine bright enough to shame the sun, but Phaedra had to keep shit real. If resurrected, her boy would never become an astronaut, surgeon, soldier, accountant, or deacon. He'd only live on as a thorn in Phaedra's side, a boil on her backside, a blister between everybody's toes. Of course, neighborhood gossips lied. Nobody had beaten Death. Seriana Jacobs failed to best Death at javelin throwing. Harriet Jones failed to best Death at gospel solos. Gracie Smith failed to best Death at eating Scotch bonnets. Ramona Sharp failed to best Death at freestyle wrestling. Dominique Clark failed to best Death at fly fishing. He flaunted his powers and squashed each woman's pride, vanity, and hope with deliberate blows. Grieving or not, challenging him was nothing but foolish. And to tell one half of the ugly, flea-bitten, stank-butt truth, Phaedra grieved her own failures more so than her son's death. Phaedra had failed to capitalize on her basketball career. Collegiate color commentators used to call her beat 'em bad Banks. No woman could drive past her. Phaedra would thump a chick quick, trample feet, shoulder-check chins. She wore a mouthpiece to every practice. She played through sprained, split lips and broken fingers. And once, during a playoff game, she had dunked before Lisa Leslie ever dreamed of wings. Although she didn't know how to stick the landing, spectators still rose to their feet and cheered. But nobody followed women's sports back in the 80s. Nike didn't throw her a shoe deal. No Russian athletic ambassador called her up to the big league. And Phaedra failed to make the most of college. She never excelled at academic chores, calculating angles, synthesizing complex compounds, or debating reparations, but she was far from a fool. She knew ancestral musculature cultivated in farms, butcher shops, and factories could be repurposed for football fields, tennis courts, stadiums. She knew her folks had no inheritance to give her but the raw strength her daddy, granddaddy, and great-grandmama had cultivated to survive lives defined by menial labor. Hard hours spent smelting iron, sawing logs, canning sardines, digging ditches, swinging hammers, tanning leather, cutting steel, lubricating cogs, mixing soap, slaughtering hogs, sewing stitches, scrubbing grout, breaking stone. All the necessary work fairer folks couldn't be bothered to do. She knew broad shoulders and thick thighs could reverse a family's fortunes, but she had failed to turn her muscles into money. She had failed to convince Jackson that he could be the one to succeed. Even though Jackson had inherited the size and athleticism to play beautiful basketball, he resented how hard she pushed him in the sport and always self-sabotaged just to spite her. She believed he could have had scholarships, sponsorships, but all throughout high school he'd brick easy shots, drop passes, lose games, shake his head and claim he had bad nerves. He might have botched fast plays on the court, but he never gave up a chance to humiliate Phaedra. He kept bricks of dirt, weed, and whatever else under her back porch, sexed up his trifling little girlfriends on her good furniture, dirtied every single dish in her kitchen, jumped rivals in the alley behind her house, and pawned her electronics for cases of cheap beer so he and his do-nothing-ass friends could ritually execute brain cells. Jackson did all that mess and more, but Phaedra figured she'd break him of his nasty habits one day. She dreamed of snapping him in two, chucking the pieces in a smelting pot, and remolding him in the shape of something useful, a sledgehammer, a machete. She never counted on burying him at 24 years old. But Phaedra couldn't deny her responsibility for how he had turned out. She had failed his dumb ass too. She had been team captain 4 years straight at Lincoln College and had been deemed a defensive wizard for the way she thwarted power forwards and kept the ball moving. But that playbook never translated to keeping her child's heart from the clutches of despair. She never succeeded in developing finesse, pivoting, and keeping Jackson safe from the inner city's corrosive bleakness. She never succeeded in keeping Jackson safe from himself or those who would do him harm. Knife wounds in his gut cemented that fact. And to tell the other half of the ugly, flea-bitten truth, Phaedra didn't have the confidence to challenge death. Worry already had her beat. She had won plaques, medals, and rings, but she was still mortal. Demanding miracles from her would be more than unfair. It'd be cruel. But Jackson felt entitled to the small, visceral pleasures living folks enjoy and made his ultimatums anyway. After keeping the company of night crawlers and lost souls for a hot minute, he straight up refused to stay dead. He escaped that Catacombs Incorporated sponsored necropolis, reattached his spiritual threads to the living world, and headed home. Cruel or not, he'd demand miracles from Phaedra. Nobody could tell him different. Phaedra suffered a crushing migraine that night of Jackson's funeral. She laid bedridden in her morning dress as her brain swelled with ache and tepid sweat. So when Jackson walked through her bedroom wall, she thought he was a hallucination. But she couldn't ignore the reality of how he filled the room with the smell of homemade wine, how blood blotched his t-shirt, how his crip breath froze her cheek, how his knife wounds gaped lurid, how his canines curved crooked when he smirked. Refusing braces had been one of the few issues Phaedra and Jackson had ever agreed upon. 10-grin nerds don't make varsity and rock the rim. She always told him he could have a mouthful of razor-straight, glistening goals once he signed with the Lakers. His lips moved, but she only heard rasping. Even though Phaedra couldn't understand one word out of his mouth, she didn't need psychic powers to know he was begging. She stared up at him through blue-black gloom and wondered how he even had the nerve. She had made an unending offering of her own flesh. She had given him the iron in his blood, the kink in his hair, the swagger in his stride, the curl in his lip. He had taken bread from her mouth, milk from her breast. How in the hell could he ask for more? She scrunched her eyes closed and wished Jackson would vanish with the sizzle and wisp of smoke, but his connection to the living world only strengthened as he talked. A sudden, disembodied groan shook dust out of the ceiling, then his voice became audible, and he told Phaedra, "Mama, you need to quit acting like a sorry, sad-sack scrub. We got work to do." He told Phaedra the rumors he'd heard from mothers defeating death for their sons and daughters. The mothers bested death in hula hooping, trick shooting, and tap dancing, so why couldn't Phaedra hit the court for him? He had dreams and ambitions like everybody else. Jackson smoothed a strand of hair from Phaedra's damp forehead and told her, "Mama, you owe me." Phaedra turned her back to him and said, "Boy, I don't owe you a goddamn thing."
I think that for me, primarily writing is an act of communication and connection. I think once you begin writing or pursuing any kind of artistic field, it starts out as expression, but after a while, I feel like you can only get so much out of pure expression. You have to figure out how you can connect to someone on a human and even spiritual level, and that's where it becomes really interesting, making those connections in ways that you didn't even think would be possible. So naturally, I know that I have my own emotions and I have my own feelings and experiences, but it's just like one small sliver of human experience. And even, if you think about it as far as geography, race, gender, socioeconomic status, I can talk about my experience in a more specific way, but that's still just one small sliver of it, no matter how deeply I explore it. So naturally, anything that you create, it doesn't really live until it lives on in other people and it makes them think. And that's something that I always appreciate when I read something really interesting, is I like the effect of being haunted by something, or even when you read something or you watch something and it really changes your worldview for a few days. It might not be something that lasts, but it's really kind of to me, and it's strange, I'm a person who has an existential crisis like twice a month. So when I read something and it changes my outlook, even if it's just temporary, I really respect and appreciate that. And it makes me think that there must be some kind of power or reasoning behind that. So I think a lot of conflicts, and I think that a lot of pain and suffering is caused by a lack of understanding and a fear of trying to understand or being a concern for other people. And there's also that fear of vulnerability, which I think that it takes a lot of strength to be vulnerable and to realize that if you're vulnerable, sometimes you're going to get hurt. Sometimes people won't notice it. Sometimes people will take advantage of you. But if you're strong enough to withstand that and find a way to connect with people who will work to understand and realize what you're putting on the table and why it's valuable, I think that's worth it.
Next up is New York Times bestselling author Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. Nana's works can be found in many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, Esquire, Literary Hub, and the Paris Review. He reads a selection from his book, Friday Black, The Finkelstein Five.
Phila, the headless girl, walked toward Emmanuel, her neck jagged with red savagery. She was silent, but he could feel her waiting for him to do something, anything. Then his phone rang and he woke up. He took a deep breath and set the blackness in his voice down to a 1.5 on a 10-point scale. Hi there, how are you doing today? Yes, I did recently inquire about the status of my application. Well, all right, okay. Great to hear. I'll be there. Have a spectacular day. Emmanuel rolled out of bed and brushed his teeth. The house was quiet. His parents had already left for work. That morning, like every morning, the first decision he made regarded his blackness. His skin was a deep, constant brown. In public, when people could actually see him, it was impossible to get his blackness down anywhere near a 1.5. If he wore a tie, wing-tip shoes, smiled constantly, used his indoor voice, and kept his hands strapped and calm at his sides, he could get his blackness as low as 4.0. Though Emmanuel was happy about scoring the interview, he also felt guilty about feeling happy about anything. Most people he knew were still mourning the Finkelstein verdict. After 28 minutes of deliberation, a jury of his peers had acquitted George Wilson Dunn of any wrongdoing whatsoever. He had been indicted for allegedly using a chainsaw to hack off the heads of 5 black children outside the Finkelstein Library in Valley Ridge, South Carolina. The court had ruled that because the children were basically loitering and were not actually inside the library reading, as one might expect of productive members of society, it was reasonable that Dunn had felt threatened by these 5 black young people, and thus, he was well within his rights when he protected himself, his library-loaned DVDs, and his children by going to the back of his Ford F-150 and retrieving his Hawtech Pro 18-inch 48cc chainsaw. The case had seized the country by ear and heart and was still, mostly, the only thing anyone was talking about. Finkelstein became the news cycle. On one side of the broadcast world, anchors openly wept for the children, who were saints in their eyes. On the opposite side were personalities like Brent Kogan, the ever-gruff and opinionated host of What's the Big Deal?, who had said during an online panel discussion, yes, they were kids, but also fuck niggers. Most news outlets fell somewhere in between. On verdict day, Emmanuel's family and friends of many different races and backgrounds had gathered together and watched a television tuned to a station that had sympathized with the children, who were popularly known as the Finkelstein Five. Pizza and drinks were served. When the ruling was announced, Emmanuel felt a clicking and grinding in his chest. It burned. His mother, known to be one of the liveliest and happiest women in the neighborhood, threw a plastic cup filled with Coke across the room. When the plastic fell and the soda splattered, the people stared at Emmanuel's mother. Seeing Miss John meant it was real. They lost. Emmanuel's father walked away from the group, wiping his eyes, and Emmanuel felt the grinding in his chest settle to a cold nothingness. On the ride home, his father cursed. His mother punched honks out of the steering wheel. Emmanuel breathed in and watched his hands appear, then disappear, then appear, then disappear as they rode past streetlights. He let the nothing he was feeling wash over him in one cold wave after another. But now that he'd been called in for an interview with Stitches, a store self-described as an innovator with a classic sensibility that specialized in vintage sweaters, Emmanuel had something to think about, besides the bodies of those kids severed at the neck, growing damp and thick, pulsing, shooting blood. Instead, he thought of what to wear. In a vague move of solidarity, Emmanuel climbed to his loose-fitting cargos he'd worn on a camping trip. Then he stepped into his patent leather Space Jams with the laces still clean and taut as they weaved up all across the black tongue. Next, he pulled out a long ago abandoned black hoodie and dove into its tunnel. As a final act of solidarity, Emmanuel put on a gray snapback cap, a hat similar to the ones 2 of the Finkelstein Five had been wearing the day they were murdered, a fact George Wilson Dunn's defense had stressed throughout the proceedings. Emmanuel stepped outside into the world, his blackness at a solid 7.6. He felt like Evel Knievel at the top of a ramp. At the mall, he looked for something to wear to the interview, something to bring him down to at least a 4.2. He pulled the brim of his hat forward and down to shade his eyes. He walked up a hill toward Canifer Road where he'd catch a bus. He listened to the gravel scraping under his sneakers. It had been a very long time since he'd had his blackness anywhere near a 7.0. I want you safe. You gotta know how to move, his father had said to him at a very young age. Emmanuel started learning the basics of his blackness before he knew how to do long division, smiling when angry, whispering when he wanted to yell. Back when he was in middle school, after a trip to the zoo where he'd been accused of stealing a stuffed panda from the gift shop, Emmanuel had burned his last pair of baggy jeans in his driveway. He'd watched the denim curl and ash in front of him with unblinking eyes. When his father came outside, Emmanuel imagined he'd get a good talking to. Instead, his father stood quietly beside him. This is an important thing to learn, his father had said. Together, they watched the fire till it ate itself dead. That's the beginning of that first story. Thanks.
I think there's so many things that inspire me, but I'm thinking about like today, where there's we're sort of expected to have like a regular life in the wake of, so many people are murdered because of their belief, sort of this like, I don't know, we're just like, and just how normal that might be, tragically. And so in the back of my head, I just have this like feeling like today, actually, this feeling of like, this is really bad. We're acting like it's okay, but maybe we should all mean the world as a whole, sort of step back and be like, how did we get here? And so yeah, I guess maybe that background trauma that's on loop is a big inspiration for me. But also, I don't know, maybe even more than that, the sort of hope that is still there no matter what, that can't kind of be squashed. The fun, the way that things that I've done to sort of get through maybe a really tough shift, just the noticing and appreciation of little, maybe potentially in some people's minds, insignificant interactions that really were super meaningful to me. So, I think that sort of macro, micro sort of appreciation of things that are happening for me, I think about that a lot, and I think the stories come out of a lot of that sort of noticing, wondering, and feeling uneasy, and also feeling grateful.
Chaya Bhuvaneswar is a physician and writer whose debut story collection, White Dancing Elephants, is a best book for Kirkus Reviews and included as recommended reading by BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, and Vulture.
The situations that many of these characters are living through are often the result of what happened before and how they're going to find their way into a future. And I think we all think about that a lot, so I feel like that may be why the collection has resonated with more people than we expected. I'm going to read a story called Heitor, and it's about a little known history of the Portuguese in India and sort of what they took from us and how they took it, but also a story of my imagining kind of a heist story from the viewpoint of an Indian slave. One October evening in the year of our blessed Lord, 1545, a male Indian slave, once advertised as being in the most robust health, his young skin shining like sturdy striped mahogany from all the healing scars of past whippings, stood chained in the cool courtyard of the convent in Evora, in imperial Portugal. He was awaiting punishment. As a mercy, One of the sisters had allowed him to continue wearing a loincloth, though at the moment of his death, Hetor knew that even this insignificant black rag would be forced off. The covering was for the benefit of the 50 or so women, some of them still girls, who lived in the convent for lifetimes and who, like Mariana, a 16-year-old novitiate, were never supposed to see any man's genitals. Yet she had contrived once to see Hetor sleeping on the ground outside the stables. She had found his body beguiling, had ordered him to stand guard outside her bedroom door on several nights, though he had resisted doing more. When his death came, it would be a gunshot. Hetor would not be blindfolded. But no one could prevent him from closing his eyes when the pistols were raised and seeing vivid memories. As a child, Hetor was taken at the age of 7 by slave traders from Lisbon, remote but proud descendants of Vasco da Gama, who'd entered the Indian Ocean a century before. Hetor's tiny mother was struck to the ground in a village in Bengal after the elders, without consulting her, captured her son and then sold him. Small for his age, easily bound, Hetor was brought by ship and by force, by the sons of spice traders, by the members of large, prosperous companies, brothers of men who had settled in Goa, the place in India where the first human remains of the old world were once found. Those traders had married the most beautiful Indian women they could find. With jewels stolen from the women's own ancestors, their wives were converted to Christianity. Hetor was sold for an elite price to work for the nuns of Evora and their novitiates. Indian, Chinese, Japanese slaves were bought and sold in Portuguese cities, believed to be more intelligent and less potent as males than African slaves, and thus allowed to work in the convents. As a child, Hetor was striking for his quietude, his gentleness, which formed a graceful harmony with the aggressive energy of his hard and strong limbs. Beginning at the quick, observant, diligent age of 8, Hetor was saved from doing harder labor, given to the convent's Indian gardener and its cook. The 2 men were nowhere to be found on his last night. The men, lovers, were hiding for fear of being chained. They were both drunk and in despair that they had not foreseen Hetor's fate. His 2 passionate adoptive fathers, who knew how to grow the choicest sprigs of lavender to place on dinner plates, who also knew the art of capoeira, a fighting form evolved to fend off slave traders, one of many methods of survival that Indians would learn from Brazilian men, from black crew members who frequented taverns and inns in the city where the cook and gardener were sent to do errands. Those crew members, in their turn, bought young Japanese women as slaves and bragged to each other how much they enjoyed them. The cook and gardener also were devoted to pleasure. Believing Hetor should have the same, they had taught him capoeira, cooking, and all the other arts. The men had intended Hetor to inherit their small trove of possessions. Those 2 men, slaves of the convent, even suggested which girls in the village Hetor could make love to in secret. Mariana, the rich virgin who desired Hetor, didn't know about those girls. If the oldest and most powerful of the nuns of Montemor had ever known about the welcoming village girls, each of whom were, after all, some respectable tradesman's daughter, by now the police would have torn off Hetor's balls, yet forced him to go on working, go on living. Now, less than an hour remained until Hetor would be killed for far different crimes. Every week, at least 2 policemen searched the convent's surrounding gardens for criminals, all of whom were seeking sanctuary on holy lands, all trying to evade having their hands and feet cut off for stealing. No one dared covet the king's gold, won back as it had been only a few centuries before from the Moors, from those stealthy, marauding, dark ones, and before that, seized by the Portuguese explorers and traders. Oh, those daring, wise ones. Oh, those Europeans so unafraid to travel to the far end of the world. Mariana was from one of Lisbon's wealthiest slave-trading families. A year away from her permanent vows, she now talked of leaving the convent. She teased Hector, allowed him to see her nude body, left him gifts at the slave quarters, even compelled him to stand near while she took her bath. She pleaded sick so she could miss prayers. Through cook and gardener, she sent word asking for Hector, only for Hector. Her merchant father could have bought him from the nuns at Mariana's pleasure. Terrified of being sold again, Hector pretended to run away. Caught, again enslaved, Hector could die now, knowing no one would ever know the truth. That he, Hector, had stolen back the conqueror's gold, stolen the stolen Christian gold, stolen before that from Indian temples and palaces, from statues melted down so that the features of gods and goddesses were long ago forfeit. That gold, accumulated, stacked, a pestilence to the native people, had been a providence to the Portuguese, and what they seized triumphant and knowing at their first opportunity. The bags of gold Hector had filled up with pilfered coins, only a few at a time, would pay for his woman, Sita, to escape to America. She would be a stowaway, a crew member's concubine. Then, to gain her freedom, Sita would smother this man once he was drunk and asleep. Once Sita freed herself from him, whoever it was that would be her last master, as soon as the ship reached Manhattan Island, she would tell her descendants that it was Hector, a man possessed of his full powers, though forced to pretend otherwise, a man whose gold had carried them across the waves, a man who'd been a slave, yet staked the mother of his beloved child, so she and the baby she carried could hide in the New World. Thank you. I think that Patricia Highsmith has this great saying about how when you find something you should write about or need to write about, there's this throb. You know, and I think that's absolutely right. Like if something doesn't completely grab you, you shouldn't be writing that thing, you know, because if it doesn't grab you, it's not going to grab your reader. So for me, it was so unforgettable and visceral, the transformation from being just a regular person to producing people out of me and then being their mother, you know, like it's been such a transformative kind of process, but I don't think that's true for everyone, and certainly not true for everyone in the same way. So I think the sensory aspect of writing is incredibly important to me. Sensory detail, feeling like I'm there, wanting to make you feel like you're there with me.
As a special treat, the authors take time out to interview each other on stage, giving the audience insights into their work and their creative process.
That also makes me curious about the historical references used in your stories. They really add a lot of rich detail and texture. When it comes to your research, how do you balance out the need to research and really nail down those details and also honor your creative impulses?
I think it's really important to allow yourself to write a draft without looking anything up. I mean, I've violated that sometimes, like writing a paragraph saying, that building I saw 3 years ago, and then, you know, like write whatever. But I think it's really important that the past or some other history as it exists in your imagination, you just honor it, because it might take you into a completely different research than some kind of intellectualized idea of what your story is quote unquote about.
In sort of arriving at a story, I'm wondering, do you have sort of a voice first? Do you have like this situation in mind? What is it that likes you, like, because you seem to have like these like really fleshed out worlds that kind of, for me, a lot of them have like this mythic feel, and not only the ones that directly employ sort of
mythology, but sort of mythic, epic depth to them. And I'm wondering, when you're arriving at a story, what sort of like makes you be like, oh wait, this is something this is actually gonna manifest to something, you know? What does that feel like for you?
That's another really thoughtful, kind of question that honors me, because I feel like anytime I have to write, it's so precious. I don't want to sort of over pressure it and say, I want to write about, the Real Housewives. Don't write about the, look, I mean, I don't want to, I don't want to like that.
I'll read that.
But, I do think stories exist outside of us. I really do think that. I really do think stories exist independent of us, and we're listening to them, we're uncovering them, something kind of comes out. But I think when they really press on us, like there's something I'm working on now, and I sometimes get a little worried, like too much time is passing. What am I doing? I'm like tweeting about the other book. I should be working on this, But I know she'll be there. I know she'll be there, the person who's at the pivot of this story. I know she'll be there. And I don't really fully know why, except I strongly encourage anyone in the audience who wants to write, thinks about writing, put yourself in situations where you really get to listen, or it really matters to someone else that you are there. Because I think that is, in some ways, what's happening when a story is being given to you. I've been so thrilled, about the success of Friday Black, instant New York Times bestseller, movie adaptation for Universal. Just, it's huge and huge. Gene Stein, award recipient from PEN America. Huge, 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 And, but yet what I really wonder about is, you're so lovely and nice, but the stories are so fierce and biting. What has it been like to go to different parts of the U.S. and hear from people, diverse people, what their reaction was to being confronted that way?
Thank you. It's been, someone asked me the other day, like, how have you been processing from the PEN Award? And I'm like, I haven't processed the book coming out. It came out in October. I'm still sort of like, because, prior to this last couple of months, people had read my stories were me and like my Facebook friends, And so, yeah, to go to like Texas or Missouri, I spent most of my life within 300 miles of where I was born. I'm from New York. I was born in Queens, New York. I live in Spring Valley, Rockland County. So to like, I can't really describe it. It's wild. And it's even wild from someone from my high school, saying they liked it. That's as wild as anything. I've had people in Savannah, a black woman who was probably, my mother's age, talking to me about how, man, I really felt seen in that story, and I'm going through something right now. She had a very specific thing about whatever. I can't get into it, but like, it's very hard for me to locate in reality. Actually, I'm just like, so I just try to take it one day at a time and just be like, you worked hard, so this is happening. But I feel grateful, especially for people like you, people who kind of our cohort, who kind of can share it, because I can like ask and feedback, like, wait, this is real, right? And so I'm very grateful. I want to ask another thing, because it's connected to what you said about that precious writing time. And like you mentioned it a little bit when you were reading. I don't know if people know, because I find this like very inspiring, and I think could be inspiring for a lot of people who feel like, oh, I just can't do it because I'm doing this other thing. A whole-ass doctor. You are a real doctor,
Yeah, we definitely don't have the option of being half-ass.
A parent, and, and you're doing this book, and you are also, like you said, like, responsible for, like, publicizing a lot of it, too. So kind of just how, for people who wouldn't know. Because I want to know. How?
I think, it's interesting, because this is the first year. It's an intimate event. It's, so I hope I will share with this audience. Actually, I haven't shared with other audiences.
I got an exclusive.
This is kind of big.
So I'm good at it.
When I was in my teens, I was told from my very, patriarchal, Brahmanical Hindu family structure, of which my dad was really just the mouthpiece. Now that I think about it more and more, like, I thought, oh, it's dad, but it really wasn't. He had centuries of people kind of speaking through him as the megaphone, that I was going to have an arranged marriage, and I didn't have a choice about it. And someone was going to be chosen who had a good family, meaning the same caste and same region, same language. And I really felt like someone put a coffin around me. I really felt that my life was ending. I would do things to evade this, but I was running. I was really running, and I really feel like I can't say no to anything that I can have in my life in any reasonable capacity, because I almost died at 17. I actually really believe that. So, and I'm saying it only because I used to think, oh, it's generational, and no one will get it now, but it's still very real. Like all kinds of constriction of women's lives and women's choices and what they feel like they can do and can't do. So for me, it has that meaning that I didn't want to leave my family of origin and be quote unquote alone. So I made an effort to create a family with a partner, and I didn't want to be financially dependent on that partner the way I would have been with an arranged marriage husband. So I got an occupation because I didn't think writers could make any money, but obviously we're all wrong about that.
Who are you talking about? Somebody?
There's a reason why people grab onto a lot of life, and often it's because you really believed and had every reason to believe you'd have nothing. So for me, it's that. So no one should feel like they have to do it all to have a big CV or something at all. Doing one thing with a lot of fidelity is worth everything.
That's incredible, and I think that it was already inspiring. Now I feel like even more so, just to really know, that happened, and then how you just sort of flipped that into this life that you really wanted. And I think there's so many people, because I feel like there's like an emphasis on, I don't know, doing stuff quick or amazing or immediately. And so I think that's really beautiful to see.
To get back on the thought of arrangement, so reading the Finkelstein Five at the beginning of the collection felt very raw and cathartic to me in particular. I immediately identified with Emmanuel, and this story was so bold that I was surprised by the time I got to Lightspitter. I was impressed by how the terrorist William Cropper was rendered with such tenderness and the commitment to approaching him as a human being. Yeah. When writing characters who do horrendous, unforgivable things, is it natural to jump inside their perspective and give both sides of the coin, or was this a challenge you gave yourself in particular?
I think it is a challenge, because I think we're so trained to sort of look at the evil of this world as sort of like, I don't know, super alien. And for me, part of the process of writing is, to allow yourself into the mind of these people is not to say not to pardon them. It's to do the hard work of realizing these people that do the worst things are human beings too. We call them monsters, and even the word criminal is a way of thinking of these things, people as other. But for me, I think the hard thing is to be like, that's a person who has the capacity to love too. Something happened to him or her, and we kind of lost them. And to me, that's hard, but also to me, it's ultimately hopeful, because one, it makes me think of the potential for redemption that is hopefully always there, and it makes me think about how I can implicate the institution as opposed to these individuals. I'm worried about these institutions of big picture, homogenous sort of patriarchy, especially, or this white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy, you know what I mean? And what does that do to people? How does that kind of put pressure on their humanity and make them into these other things? So that's the things I try to implicate most. And so by using that, I'm able to sort of look at this kid and be like, where did we lose him,
As the evening winds down, books are signed, connections made, and conversations continue as Katara and her band play their final number.
Conversations golden, really got me hoping. I just wanna be around. What is where I'm going? All this mental hand holding. I just wanna be around. Constellation shaping and molding, never rate of unfolding. Feelings building up. Now I'm off the ground. watching how you watch me walk out the door. Never really felt this type of way before. Every time I'm in attendance, I want more. Suffering, silly dreams, got me thinking about you and oppositely. Hoverings in my mind, got me hiding fantasies like love's a crime. Tracing all my steps and rewinding time. That time I looked at you, thought I could read your mind. Or maybe I was seeing things, the things I find. Well, I just wanna be around. I just wanna be around. Maybe you can come around. Maybe I can, maybe you can, maybe we can. Or maybe I can see you around. Can I see you around? 'Cause your conversation's golden, 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 golden. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Your conversation's golden, 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 golden. Yeah,
In closing, a few final thoughts from our authors for you to consider as you read their works or write your own.
I think the most important thing would be to embrace both frustration and faith. Making anything is incredibly difficult and it's a painstaking process, but ultimately it's really worthwhile. And it's sort of strange because so it doesn't take that long to read a 16-page story, but to see somebody read through it smoothly and be able to reread it, that's very pleasurable to know that the effort and the time and the hours that you put into it paid off. If you have a process and you pursue it and you keep pushing, and everybody has a different way. I like to really work on the line level and work on the line strength, and that helps me have breakthroughs. And I also respect the fact that, there are some people that can sit down and their goal is to write 5 pages in a day, and that's fantastic. If I write a paragraph in a day, I'm overjoyed. So it's a lot of, you have to accept frustration, you have to have faith in yourself, and just the fact that if you keep working on it steadily, it doesn't even necessarily have to be day by day, but if you keep a regular practice, you will get better. And there will come that moment where it's both exciting when other people notice what you're doing and they can take something from it, but also it's really great when you notice it, when you pick up a story or something you made later and you look at it and you say, like, who did this? Like, this turned out pretty well, this is okay. And that makes it worthwhile.
Find a community of people that sort of understand where you're coming from. You can't be dependent on this place that is also your sort of main academic space, also your main sort of artistic space, also to be maybe your social space too, I think. So try to branch out if you can. And also, in those kind of spaces, find sort of solace in your work if you can. For me, that was the thing. I was so focused, so hardcore, kind of crazy almost into trying to get my work done that it was that's where I was actually. That's where I inhabited really that book.
I think that the basis of process is something every writer I admire has said again and again. Don't mystify process. Just start with yourself, no matter how crappy you feel or how bad you think the product is going to be, and you just sit there and it's just you and you write it. They go to bed with Garbo, they wake up with me kind of thing. It's that. It's you. You don't have to be Garbo. I hope so much that more people write. That's what I really hope. More people with day jobs just write and see what comes out.